that's working? Okay. All right, we'll get started. So we only have 30 minutes, so there's only so much detail we can go into all these different things. I'll try to cover as much as possible, but if anyone has further questions, you can always call our office. I'm happy to talk. So when I was thinking about this talk, I was thinking about, what we consider a weed. And that's not always a very straightforward term. Sometimes we use the word weed to casually refer to many different plants. And when I thought about this, what I realized is we really break it down into usually 3 groups of problem or nuisance plants. We have common garden weeds, we have things that are invasive plants, and then we have noxious weeds. So what is a weed? A weed is an undesirable plant. It may be a species that is impeding or negatively impacting your goals or desired use for the space. Maybe it's a plant that self-seeds and spreads easily, and it competes with plants you would rather have in your space. A weed can be a native or a non-native plant. And here we have dandelion and borage. These are 2 common garden weeds we have, or borage is sometimes something that's purposefully planted, but if it's not contained, it can spread and become weedy. Does the plant that you are looking at impact your desired aesthetic for the space? Is it impacting production? Maybe it's native, but it's toxic to livestock and human health, and you're trying to manage for livestock. Does the plant spread quickly and impede with activities at the site? We can think about maybe native vegetation that's growing out of control along a boat launch or shoreline. Maybe you just don't like the plant and it impacts your preferred plants. So a weed is really anything that you don't want in your space. It can be a plant out of place, or maybe a weed is in the eye of the beholder. And here we have horsetail, which is, in my mind, a beautiful native plant, but it's toxic to livestock. So maybe that's a problem weed that you're combating. And then we have lemon balm, which I know a lot of people plant because it's a very aromatic herb, but it can spread and become weedy. And then one step up from just your common weed is invasive plants. So this has, I put a definition here, I like plants that are not native. So they're plants that are not from here. And they, once they're introduced into an environment, they will establish quickly, they spread quickly. These plants can fill in spaces, outcompete native plants. Maybe they harm the environment or economy. And an invasive plant, it can take a while sometimes for us to really see the impact. So I put 2 up here, vinca or periwinkle, which is a popular ground cover. But if it ends up in natural areas, it can spread quickly and can be invasive. And then also this is a photo from actually the city of Shelton. It's watercress, believe it or not. Watercress was planted. It's a popular salad green. But watercress, if it ends up in slow-moving creeks or ditches, it can reproduce quickly. It can impede water movement. So these are plants that can be invasive at some sites. And then the next step up is the noxious weeds. So that's the group of plants that I usually work with. Noxious weeds are actually, it's a legal definition of plants that have control laws around them. There's federal noxious weed laws that are outlined in the Plant Protection Act. And then we have Washington state noxious weed laws. All the noxious weeds are non-native plants that are highly invasive. Once they become established, control is very costly and very time consumptive. These plants will threaten our local environment. They can threaten our economy. Some of them are toxic and can negatively impact our agricultural systems. Others pose a threat to health and human safety. So the 2 I have up here, you can see spurge laurel on the bottom and then perennial pepperweed. Both of these plants are forming large monocultures. This is something that's very common of noxious weeds. Once they establish, they'll form huge patches and outcompete native plants. They negatively impact our local environments and habitats and reduce forage and habitat for wildlife. The state noxious weed laws are outlined in RCW 1710 and the WAC 16750. But basically, these noxious weed laws are specifying that landowners have the requirement to control certain noxious weeds on their properties. Every year, the county weed boards meet and they vote on the weed list, so that gets updated annually. And the weed control laws vary county to county. So it's based on the distribution of the plant in that area. Once something is too widespread, often it will not be required for control in an area because it's not feasible for us to enforce landowners or eradicate it from the environment. The weed list is broken down into 3 classes. So you have Class A weeds. These are things that are very limited in the state or they're new to the state. Eradication is required by law for Class A weeds. Giant hogweed is one of our more notable Class A weeds. This is actually a site in downtown Shelton. And we won't get into giant hogweed identification, but it's a plant that poses risk to health and human safety. It creates sap that will burn or cause blisters. And then Class B weeds are more varied in their distribution, and the state requires control for Class B designates. The county governments can choose to select certain Class B weeds. Class C weeds are the most common noxious weeds. So these are things like oxeye daisy, common St. John's wort, and usually Class C weeds have some sort of impact to agricultural systems, and the county governments can select Class C weeds for control. When we are designing a control strategy for a site, we focus on integrated pest management. Integrated pest management can be adapted depending on your site or your goals for the space. It will change depending on the weed species you're working with and how much you have. But we always focus with IPM on starting with the most environmentally friendly method and then integrating other control strategies as needed. Other parts of IPM are making sure you're controlling plants at the right time of year, so weeding things before they produce seed. Maybe if you need to integrate herbicide control, doing it at the right time with the right chemical. And the methods that we focus on when doing integrated pest management are manual, mechanical, cultural controls, biocontrols, chemical prevention, and proper disposal. And we'll go into these a little bit more. So the best way and most cost-effective way to control invasive species or weeds in your property are first preventing them. So one of the things we can do is buy weed-free soil, gravel. Many places will get inspections done so that they have certified weed-free materials. If you are working in an area where you know weeds are occurring, brush your boots, clean your equipment. If you're riding horses or taking off-road vehicles in an area with known weeds, clean your equipment before you're moving it into a new area. Inspect recently purchased nursery stock. Oftentimes we'll find little annual weeds or other weed seeds in nursery plants that we buy. And then if you have material that's been brought into an area, inspect it over the next few years. Look for new things germinating because that's often a way that weeds will move around. And when you're picking plants to plant, focus on planting native or non-invasive things because this will reduce the likelihood of introducing invasive species to your area. And also, I didn't put this on there, but be wary of wildflower mixes because sometimes they can be contaminated. So once you find a weed population on your property and you need to start using a control strategy, for small populations, typically what's used first is manual or mechanical control. This is the most environmentally friendly and least invasive method of control. This can be things like hand pulling. So you can see someone there hand pulling a flowering plant. Maybe you have something with a deeper taproot, so you need to dig it out using a tool like a shovel or a pick. Mowing can be a control strategy that you can integrate, but a note on mowing is many plant species will spread easily from mowing if they have seeds on them. And if a plant is very invasive, mowing will often only delay flowering. So it won't actually stop and work as a total control strategy. If you have a plant that is going to seed or blooming, you can deadhead it. So there's a picture of someone deadheading giant hogweed. Maybe you have a whole field of tansy, so it's not practical to pull and bag all the plants. So you want to do a combination of deadheading and bagging the flowers and then pulling the green part. Deadheading is a great way to control weeds. And maybe you have a plant that is too large to control with these other control strategies. So excavation with large-scale equipment is also an option for some sites. So once you have manually removed all your weeds, what do you do with them? Proper disposal is another great way to mitigate the spread of weeds. And I put that it varies between plant species. And in a perfect world, what we say is pull and bag everything that's blooming. Pull and bag your weeds, put them in the garbage, and that's a way to stop the spread. That's not always practical depending on your site, depending on how much of something you have. So I like to point out that it can vary depending on the plant species. But in general, if something has flowers or seeds on it, you want to bag those flowers and put them in the garbage. If you have maybe larger woody vegetation like Scotch broom, it might be beneficial to pull these plants and pile them in an area where you know they won't reroot, because it's not always practical to pay a disposal fee for a large quantity of woody vegetation. But you can see here we have blooming plants that have been bagged. They're going to be sealed, and then those will be taken into the garbage for a disposal. If you, again, like we said, if you have a large number of blooming plants, maybe deadhead them, bag the seeds, pull the green part, dispose of that in another way where you don't have to bag all of it. And then I put this on here, toxic plants will stay toxic after dried. That's something to think about if you're manually removing poison hemlock or tansy ragwort. If you're working in a pasture or an area where animals still have access, you really don't want to pull those plants and leave them on the ground, because many times plants will remain toxic after they're dried. So it's best to bag those plants and dispose of them in the garbage. And then do not put weeds in your compost or natural area. This is very important. Weeds will often reproduce through vegetative fragments, or they can still produce seed even after they're pulled if they're blooming. So you can see a large yellow archangel infestation was started after weeds were improperly disposed of in a natural area. Your home compost bin does not get hot enough to destroy most weed seeds. So if something is blooming, it's best that you bag it and put it in the garbage. Cultural control is very important to integrate if you want long-term success for weed management. And cultural control basically means that we are manipulating the environment in some way to make it less suitable for weeds. So this can be things like adding fertilizer to your soil and focusing on the nutrients and fertility, altering the pH so that it's less acidic or less basic to make it less favorable for certain weeds. These can be barriers, so things like mulches, weed cloth. These will suppress weeds, block out sunlight, stop their germination. Planting cover crops in the winter. Anything you can do to reduce bare soil, such as planting cover crops or mulching, this will reduce the introduction of weeds. Selective watering through drip irrigation will help to target your watering so that you're not feeding all of the vegetation in your garden unnecessarily and encouraging it to grow. Maybe you have a weed like buttercup that thrives in soggy soil conditions, so improving drainage could help with your weed control over time. Biocontrols are another piece of that integrated pest management story. These are insects or organisms that often they're insects, but they can be other organisms that we release to eat or kill back the invasive species. Biocontrols are never going to work to eradicate a weed population. They are just going to lower the injury level. So if you really want to eradicate a weed, I would focus on other control strategies, but biocontrols are a great thing to integrate if a plant is either too far gone to be required for control, or if the site is inaccessible to humans. Biocontrols are a great thing to integrate. And then chemical control. So if you are working with a certain plant species that spreads through fragmentation, or mowing encourages its growth, or maybe your site is too large to only use manual removal, you may need to integrate herbicide. And if you're at a point to do this, it's very important that you read and follow all label instructions. This includes applying during, it's not limited to, but just to highlight some of the important things, limiting your spray during windy times, wear proper PPE, make sure you're storing of the chemical correctly, don't apply during too hot days or too cold days, and make sure you're using the right herbicide for the right species. If you are at a point where you're needing to use herbicide for your control, it's very important that you research to make sure you're doing control in the proper way so that you are getting the best control with your product. And then also in Washington State, herbicide use is heavily restricted if it's in or near water. So do not apply in and around water without proper applicator licenses. And then always, wash your hands, clothes after work to protect yourself. Wash your hands before eating and drinking. And then avoid spraying during bloom time because this will reduce the impact to pollinators. So now we're going to get into identification of some of our regulated noxious weeds. So these are plants that do require control in our area. Okay, so poison hemlock. This is one of the more notable noxious weeds. It's one that we don't have a ton of yet, but it is spreading in our area. It is in the carrot family, so it spends, if you think about parsley or cilantro, garden carrots, the frilly dissected foliage that it gets, the leaves of poison hemlock look very similar. So during the first year, you'll just have a couple basal leaves that are deep green, dissected. It will bolt during the second year and produce a very tall stem that can grow up to 9 feet tall, sometimes 12 feet tall, depending on the site. The stem is smooth, so it lacks hairs, and it's covered in a purple blotching. The flower is the white umbrella-shaped flower that you typically see on the carrot family, and it blooms from April to August. This plant is highly toxic, so if you do find it in your yard, you really want to take care when you're controlling it. Wear gloves, long sleeves, long pants, and you want to use a shovel or a pick to remove the root. It's in the carrot family, so it has a very deep taproot. Manual removal for poison hemlock is very effective. If you have a small patch of it, this plant is very easy to eradicate with manual removal. You just have to be persistent. Sometimes you'll have large plants like this. Some people will get skin irritation if the leaves rub on them, so be careful with that. Wear long sleeves, and you can see it doesn't show up well, but there's actually a shovel next to that plant, so that was quite a tall one. And even a plant that tall, one person can get it out with a shovel. It's quite easy. But again, you want to take care. And poison hemlock does remain toxic after dried. I think it can remain toxic up to 3 years. So this is one where you really want to bag it and you want to dispose of it in the garbage. Okay, tansy ragwort. So this is one of the more common noxious weeds that we have in Mason County. If you drive down the roadside in June, you'll see this blooming all over the place. It does require control, even though it is so widespread. It starts off its life cycle as a basal rosette. So you can see that there, it's a biennial. So it'll spend a year as just a rounded patch of ragged leaves. And then it will bolt during the second year. It will produce the flowering stem. This flowering stem is a cluster of yellow flowers, or flowers are produced in a cluster at the top of the stem. You can see in the top picture, there's many flowers in that cluster, and they have 13 petals that are surrounding an orange center. Tansy ragwort, at this stage, it can be hard to hand pull. It has sort of a fibrous root system that easily breaks off. Once it bolts, it seems like the plants are a little bit easier to yank out of the ground. If you end up with a large field of it, it might not be feasible to pull and bag all the plants. So maybe you want to combine deadheading and bagging the blooming flowers, and then you could pull the green part and dispose of that, not in bags. Tansy ragwort also will produce seeds after it's pulled if the flowers have opened. So it's very important that you bag those flowers after they are open. If you are at a point with tansy ragwort where you do need to integrate herbicide, the best stage to do it is this rosette stage. That's when you're going to have the best impact from your spray. This plant up here shows what happens if you cut tansy ragwort or mow it. It will continuously try to rebloom. And sometimes you end up with very dense bushy plants that are harder to manually remove than if you just pulled the original flowering plant. Just some more pictures of tansy ragwort so you can see a large infestation like that. Tansy will often persist in pastures if they've been overgrazed and not maintained well. So again, that's where that cultural control piece comes in. You want to have good pasture maintenance, replant to add competition, because tansy will thrive in disturbance. And then you can see staff hand pulling plants, and we have a bag with us for the flowers, and then he's putting on gloves. Tansy, because it's toxic, some people will get sick if they pull the plants. Okay, spurge laurel. So this is one that's also toxic and produces a toxic sap. It's related closely to Daphne, the fragrant winter Daphne that we have here. But you can see when it gets into the understory, it will completely take over. And because of the toxicity issue, it will pose risk to wildlife or people in the area. It's an evergreen shrub. It usually grows only about 2 to 5 feet tall. And you can see the flowers, they are produced in a small cluster at the top of the stem, and they're kind of a yellowish color. Okay, so for pulling spurge laurel, again, it has that toxic sap, so you want to wear gloves, wear long sleeves. You can pull those seedlings. The seedlings will easily reroot, so it's good to bag those and then dispose of them in the garbage. Here, we're just going to move forward a little bit. And then here you can see a larger plant and a smaller plant. Something this size is quite easy to hand pull. Even plants that are larger like that, you usually don't need equipment to bring them in or to take them out. It can be very hard to hand pull in rocky soil, but typically you can get out the plant just with a shovel or a pick. It's not deeply rooted. And then for disposal, if you end up with a ton of it, you know, in a perfect world, you would dispose of it in the garbage. If it has fruits, I would cut off those fruits, put them in a bag, dispose of them in the garbage. But if you end up with a huge amount and it's not practical to dispose of it all, maybe pick an area in your yard where you can watch it to make sure it doesn't reroot. Put pallets down, maybe put a tarp down to stop it from hitting the ground, and you can pile plants there to break down on site. Okay, lesser celandine. So this is one that was a popular ornamental at one time, and now it is not available for sale, or it should not be available for sale. If you look in the photo in the top, this is really, you know, what noxious weeds can do if we let them go. It's formed a huge monoculture. It's taken over that alder bottom. It's outcompeting native plants that are beneficial to the environment. This is a spring ephemeral, so it comes up early in the season, and then once it goes through its life cycle, it dies back, leaving bare ground. The leaves emerge first. They're heart-shaped to kidney-shaped. You can see they're deep green color. The flowers are quite beautiful. They're shiny, yellow. They have 7 to 13 petals. This plant will spread by seed, bulbil, and these tiny little tubers. So you can see there, that's an area where it's taken over. Mowing the plant, you really don't want to do that. That will spread it. You don't want to move soil containing parts of lesser celandine to new sites because that will easily spread plants. These will pop off very readily and can get lodged in tire wells and things, in grooves of tires and boots and things like that. If you have a small lesser celandine site, you can use manual removal. You want to use a shovel to get as much of the soil up, removing all the plant parts, bagging that, putting that in the garbage. You do not want to dispose of this in a natural area. That shows the bulbils that form at the stem axils, and again, those tiny little tubers that can pop off. Because of all the reproductive strategies that this plant has, if a site gets too large, often herbicide is a piece of the toolbox that you want to integrate. If you do too much manual removal, it can allow for the seeds and the bulbils to spread. It allows for soil to spread too much. But if you have a small contained site, you can do that. You just need to make sure that you bag and dispose of all the material that you think has plant parts in it. Knotweed, this is another one, like lesser celandine, that it has to be very limited in its size to use manual removal. If it's too widespread in an area, you do want to integrate herbicide. You don't want to cut or mow this plant because small pieces can fragment. It grows quite tall. It grows up to 12 feet tall, and sometimes it looks similar to an herbaceous bamboo, people will say, but it's actually knotweed. And there are 4 species of knotweed in our area. We have Japanese and giant, Bohemian, which is a hybrid of the two, and then Himalayan, which looks quite similar to these, but the leaves are more elongated. I'm just talking about them as a group here for time. Knotweed will spread quickly in riparian areas. It will come up early in the spring, and then when it dies back, it leaves behind just woody canes. So you can see the flowers there produced in a cluster, the different leaves of the knotweed. Giant knotweed is the more heart-shaped leaf, Japanese is more spade-shaped, and then the more oblong leaf is Himalayan. And then this is Bohemian, which is a hybrid of the two. Just some impacts of knotweed. So this is a picture that we took this year on one of our creeks we work on. That little bit of knotweed there is rerooting. Likely it was cut by a landowner who was mowing, and then this drifted downstream, and that little piece could reroot and start a whole new site. So that's one of the reasons we highly suggest people do not cut or mow knotweed. And then you can see here some more impacts in an urban environment. So there it is growing up along the side of a building, coming up through a utility box. And then we can see in this photo here, it's pushing up through asphalt and is spreading in that lawn. So likely it was mowed here, and that is encouraging root production. Common fennel, believe it or not, common fennel is a noxious weed. This is one we're probably all pretty familiar with as gardeners. It has very dissected foliage. The leaves are bright green. The stems can be blue to green, and then it has that yellow umbrella-shaped flower. One fennel plant can produce thousands of seeds. And if you're wondering what's the problem with fennel, because I kind of was of that mind until I saw large sites, this is what fennel can do. So it will quickly outcompete plants in dry sites. It can spread easily. Here's a site on I-5. We're starting to see more and more fennel pop up. Again, with these plants, it's only control required. So for fennel, eradication is not required. So as long as you are deadheading your plant and bagging the seeds, that meets the legal definition of fennel control. If you want to dig it out, I would suggest using a shovel or some sort of tool to remove the entire root. Okay, shiny geranium. So this is one that we don't have a ton of yet in the county, but I'm sure as we look for it, we will see more. It's a small annual or biennial. It has very shiny leaves that are lobed. They have 5 lobes that have 3 notches at the tips of the leaves. The stem you can see in the top photo, it turns red with age and they're hairless or smooth. The flowers are pink with 5 petals. This is a plant that is very easy to manually remove. It has a very shallow root system, so if you see any, I would hand pull it, maybe use a little tool to get out the root, and then make sure you bag those plants. Even if they don't have flowers or seeds on them, you don't want to put it in the compost because it can easily reroot and spread. You want to bag those plants and put them in the garbage. And then also with the plant like this, usually they'll form a very dense ground cover. So if you're working in an area, it's likely that you're going to be walking through seeds. So again, it just highlights the importance of cleaning shoes, brushing our boots before we move to new areas. Okay, non-regulated weeds. So these are noxious weeds, but these are ones that are too widespread to be required for control. So we have Scotch broom, kind of our poster child of noxious weeds, and we'll talk about Scotch broom a little more later. English ivy, so this is one that we see a lot in our area. I won't get into ID too much because we're probably all very familiar. It is a vining plant. It can form a dense ground cover, or it can grow up trees and structures. It can impact the health of trees by trapping moisture and encouraging rot, and it can quickly outcompete native plants. Ivy control, there's a few different things you can do for ivy. So if you have plants that are growing up a tree, you want to sever those vines. You know, leave a little bit of gap there so that it can't regrow, and monitor regularly to watch for regrowth. And then anything that is up from the plant you killed will die back. So you can just leave that there. Once you do that, it's a good idea to pull a buffer around the trees. This will reduce how quickly the ivy can return and grow up the tree. Pulling ivy works well. You can kind of roll it on itself to make logs, and that can give you some leverage to remove it. Using a tool like a pick or a hand tool, you can get the vines up a little bit easier. You can see here we had ivy that we did for a volunteer ivy removal, and we bagged those plants and then disposed of them in the garbage. If you have a lot of ivy that you're dealing with on your property and you don't want to pay a disposal fee, do not dispose of it in a natural area or compost, but you can do similar to like spurge laurel or some of the woody vegetation we've covered, where you can pile it on a pallet, make sure it's off the ground and won't reroot, and monitor for it to die and break down. and then you can dispose of it when it's taking up less volume. Okay, so Himalaya blackberry, again, one of our more common noxious weeds. Control is not required. It's the large thorny blackberry that we see. The leaves are pointed. The flowers come on late in the summer. They have 5 petals. They can range from white to pinkish. The stem is quite thorny. So if you're working with the plant, it's important to wear thick gloves. That's what it can do when it is allowed to take over. It will create large thickets. For Himalaya blackberry, there's a few different things you can do. You can weed whack, brush cut the plants, cut them back with loppers, find the root bundles. This time of year is a great time to do it because the ground is still wet. Watch for regrowth after you've cut plants back, and then you can use a shovel to dig up those root bundles. Those should not be put in the compost. They should be disposed of as garbage. Again, just a picture of loppers. That's a great way to cut blackberries back so you can work through it. Goats work to graze blackberries. They'll kind of just graze around the perimeter, but some people will mow paths into the center of patches to allow goats to access other areas. And then just a brush cutter up there, which is a great tool for controlling blackberries. Blackberry stems can reroot, so it's good to not put them in the compost or natural area. And with most of these weeds, it's going to take time and persistence. So just follow up and complete control as needed. Scotch broom. So this was one that we saw on that slide with the non-regulated weeds. It's a woody shrub. It's green, waxy. The leaves are quite small. The flowers are very numerous on the plant. They're usually yellow. Sometimes they can have different markings on them, but usually they're a bright yellow pea-shaped flower. Scotch broom is very tricky to eradicate from a site because the seeds stay viable for a very long time. Some sources say up to 80 years, but it seems like the accepted amount of time is about 60 to 80 years is what the sources say. Manual removal for Scotch broom works well. So you can see this is a weed wrench tool. We actually rent these for free from our office, so feel free to contact us if you want to check one out. They work to pull the Scotch broom. They're great for smaller sites. Something that the weed wrench does, though, is it does create soil disturbance. So if you use them, it's very important that you replant a site and try to minimize disturbance as much as possible. Getting a healthy plant community started in an area with Scotch broom is going to be the best way to reduce regermination. And fibrous root systems like grasses are one of the best ways to control Scotch broom. If you have a plant like this that's blooming, if it's in full bloom, a lot of people don't know this, but that's the best time to cut Scotch broom back. There's groups that do cut broom and bloom events, and they'll target blooming Scotch broom. At that point, the plant is putting the most energy into flowering, and so the likelihood of resprout is the most minimal it will be. And it's a little bit less labor intensive than pulling it. So I just want to go back to this picture. So this shows a very large Scotch broom infestation. If you have a site like that, you may need to use some large equipment like a tractor to remove the plants. That can be quite helpful. Definitely try to reseed with grass that fall because of the disturbance encouraging Scotch broom to germinate. If you use large equipment to clear it out, you'll likely end up with a sea of seedlings next year. So if you use large equipment, you clear that out, replant with grass seed, you'll see plants coming up. But if you get a healthy grass community established, you can repeatedly mow. And repeated mowing will encourage the grasses, but it will also eventually starve out the Scotch broom. So that's, again, integrating control strategies with many of these weeds is necessary. Okay, herb robber. So we'll just go over this one quick. It's probably one that people are very familiar with. It's a little annual. It has very dissected green leaves. The stems are green to red with age. They get quite hairy. This plant is very shade tolerant, so it invades forest understories. it's very easy to manually remove. So all you need to do is hand pull the plant, maybe use a tool to remove the root. Make sure you bag those. Do not put them in the compost because they will reroot easily. Just some more photos of Herb Robert. Okay, so now we're almost done. I know we're going a little bit over, but we'll be done soon. So this is just a list of non-noxious weeds, just obnoxious garden weeds that Mary asked me to cover. And none of these are noxious, so they don't require control. Some of them are native, but these are things that people often tackle in the garden. So purslane, this is one that we're all probably pretty familiar with. It's like a driveway weed, it's everywhere. It is sort of succulent, or it is succulent. When you feel it, you can feel it's quite fleshy. It will form these trailing ground covers that aren't very dense, but it does cover an area. It usually thrives in dry sites. Purslane can be easily hand pulled. So it can be easily hand pulled. You may want to use a tool like a gardening rake or a hoe to get out the root. And then you want to bag those plants and put them in the garbage. I learned while putting this talk together that all of these little leaves, if they pop off, they can reroot. So you don't want to put them in your compost because they can reroot. And you want to take care to not break apart the plant too much because that may be encouraging your issue. And then, like many things, plant a ground cover, mulch the area, reduce bare ground because that is going to help with your control. Bracken fern. So this is one, it's actually a native plant. I'm going to start there. So I do not encourage people to control bracken fern unless they really can't live with it or they're trying to manage for livestock. Bracken fern is toxic to livestock. So if you have it in a hayfield, you probably do want to manage it. Again, that kind of goes back to that, what is your goal for the space and what makes something a weed? It's, triangular fronds. It comes up as a fiddlehead with a curling top. It reproduces by spores. So you want to start control before the spores are producing on the plant. And then some bits about bracken fern control. So bracken fern is notoriously difficult to control. So it's just going to take persistence. You can pull or dig out your bracken fern, but this has to be repeated throughout the growing season and should be done again before the spores come on the plant. Mowing 3 times a year and repeating for several years can also help to eradicate bracken fern from a site. And then keep the area densely planted again, because this will reduce its regrowth. Shotweed or hairy bittercress. So this is something very common. I saw a lot of it when I was walking from my door to my truck. Ton of it in the driveway. This one's in the mustard family, and it produces tiny white flowers. It starts blooming about mid-March. So if you're wanting to control it, I would start looking for it early. The flowers are quite tiny. They have the 4 petals in the crucifix shape. That's typical of things in the mustard family. Ooh, shoot, sorry. And the leaf shape can vary. So if you want to have effective or shotweed control, I would learn how to identify this plant when it's in this rosette stage, and that way you can look for it early on and start control before it goes to seed. There's a photo of it just starting to bloom. You can see those very tiny, tiny white flowers. One of the reasons this plant is called shotweed is because after it produces seeds, if you pull it or walk through it, you'll feel the seeds shooting all over the place. So that's why you want to start control either before the plant blooms or before it produces seed, because you'll reduce the amount of seeds that you're spreading. And again, plant a ground cover, help add competition and mulch an area. That will help you with control in the future. Creeping buttercup. This plant is very hard to eradicate from a site. This is one that I'm battling where I live, and I've been pulling it. I've put sheet mulch over it, and it comes back. It's very, very vigorous. We're probably all pretty familiar with it. It forms a dense ground cover. It has sort of pointed leaves. The leaves are deep green. They have a light colored marking on them. The flowers are bright yellow, shiny with 5 petals. It is moderately toxic, so if you have livestock, I would recommend controlling it. It's not highly toxic like poison hemlock, but it is moderately toxic. And I found when I was putting this together that it can spread 40 square feet in a year. So that's quite a lot for one plant to grow. Just some more photos of it. So it will reproduce by stolons and seed. So if you're using a shovel or a tool to dig up those plants, be very careful to not fragment them because those stolons can spread. You don't want to put it in the compost because that can spread it. Again, you want to bag the plant and put it in the garbage. Okay, and then we're nearing the end, guys. Sorry, I know we're going a little bit over. Poison oak, this is actually a native plant, believe it or not, but it is quite pesky if it grows in areas where people are recreating or if it's growing near your house. Poison oak is toxic to humans. It produces a sap that gives people a very severe dermatitis in some cases. Leaves of three, let it be, is the old adage for this one. So you can see there's leaves that are in sets of three. They're oak shaped, so they look like very small oak leaves with rounded margins. This plant in our area can actually grow as a shrub or a vine. And I've seen it in both forms here. So it can be vining up trees or growing as a low shrub. So those are both things to look for. And where I often see this plant growing in our area is along the Hood Canal. I don't see it in a lot of other places, but it is around. And then in the fall, the foliage turns red. And then poison oak control. So use extreme caution when controlling poison oak. It is toxic. It produces a dermatitis for some people if they get the sap on their skin. Always wear thick gloves, ones that aren't porous, long sleeves. Some people are sensitive to the vapors of the plant, so a mask might be beneficial. You can hand pull small plants with gloves, of course, or use a shovel or tool to dig up larger plants. Goats can graze on poison oak, I learned, but sheep cannot. So maybe goats could be an option for a control method. Do not burn the plants, and you do not weed whack the plants because that can impact people if they are exposed through the vapors from burning, or if you mow, sometimes a releasing of the vapors can impact sensitive people. And then wash your clothes, tools, and equipment after you're working with poison oak. TechNew is, this is not an endorsement, but I put this up here. If you are exposed to poison oak, it's good to wash with soap and water, but TechNew is a great product to have around because it will penetrate the oils and remove it from clothing or skin better than just soap or water. Okay, and then this is our last plant. So red or sheep sorrel. This is a non-native plant that is a perennial. It will spread in disturbed sites. It thrives in acidic and nutrient deficient environments. It starts off as a rosette of small green leaves. They're spade to arrow shaped. They're only 1 to 3 inches tall. And then when it blooms, it produces a spike-shaped cluster of red or yellow flowers. Red or yellow, one is female and male. I don't remember which one, but those indicate different sexes of the flowers. And it is toxic to livestock. So if you're managing for livestock, I would recommend hand pulling it. For control, they recommend hand pulling it, being persistent and repeating over several years because it can take a while to eradicate it, using a tool to remove the root because it does have a tap root that can break off. Sheep sorrel will thrive, like I mentioned, in acidic or nutrient deficient soil. So that is one of those cultural control pieces where to meet long-term control, you may want to integrate some fertilization or maybe altering pH of the soil. Okay, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. This is my contact information. If you think of anything else, feel free to call and I'm happy to chat about weeds.